Today we're going to conclude our discussion of fallacies of vacuity by talking about self-sealers. So what's a self-sealer? Let me start by giving a definition and then giving some examples. So first, a self-sealer is a proposition or an argument that's irrefutable. It can't be refuted because it doesn't claim anything. It doesn't rule out any conceivable situation. So in that sense, it doesn't place any constraint on how the world has to be. Any possible way that the world is would conform to the proposition. So, what are some examples of that? Well, suppose someone says, and you might have heard philosophers who say this, suppose someone says, all human action is selfish. Now, at first, this seems like a bold conjecture, a very substantial thesis that could be right or it could be wrong. Now, there's an obvious objection to this thesis. You say, well, look, what about self-sacrificing heroism? Occasionally, people will lay down their lives in the service of a cause that's larger than they are. Suppose you present this counterexample to the proponent of this generalization, and they say, well, look, even self-sacrificing heroism is itself motivated by the desire to be a hero. So the person who's performing the self-sacrificing heroism is still really acting selfishly because they're just trying to satisfy their own personal desire to be a hero. Some people want chocolate, and so they go out to get chocolate. Some people want to be a hero, so they go out looking to be a hero. Okay, well, suppose we decide to investigate this further. We find people who are who tend to engage in self-sacrificing heroic behavior, maybe people who are lucky enough to have engaged in such behavior in the past and they're still alive. And so we find such people and we test them in various ways. We do brain scans of them, we give them various surveys, we do behavioral tests on them, trying to test whether or not they have the desire to be a hero. And all our tests come up empty-handed. We just don't find any evidence. No matter how many tests we perform, we don't find any evidence that this person or these people really do have the desire to be a hero. They just aren't thinking about being a hero. They just want to save the world or save their fellow people or save the environment or whatever, right? So it's because of the larger cause that they're thinking about that they engage in self-sacrificing heroic behavior, and we have no evidence that they want to be a hero. Now suppose we present all of this evidence to the proponent of the generalization in question. We say, look, we've tested these people, we've given them brain scans, we've done surveys with them, we've done all sorts of behavioral tests with them, and we can't find any evidence that they have some desire to be a hero, a desire that motivates their self-sacrificing heroic behavior. And suppose when we put this to the proponent of the generalization, they reply by saying, oh look, even if their desire to be a hero isn't rendered apparent by the tests that you've performed, it must still be there. After all, how else could we explain their self-sacrificing heroic behavior? Okay, but now it's clear that the person is offering us a self-sealer. It's a position which they can defend no matter what evidence they're presented with. Right? So no matter what evidence comes up, no matter what considerations come up, they can stick to their guns. They can continue to propound their view that all human action is selfish. But now it's pretty clear that the view that they're propounding, the proposition that they're putting forth, doesn't claim anything. It doesn't rule out any possible way that the world could be, because as we come upon various ways that the world is that seem to tell against their generalization, what they do is they make their generalization less and less specific so that even if the selfishness of which they speak isn't made manifest in any way at all, it's going to be made manifest in the human action itself. Right? So as long as there's human action, there's got to be selfishness, they say, because what other way could you explain the human action? Okay, that's a self-sealer. It's a self-sealer because they're simply insisting on the position in the face of any evidence that comes up. All right. Now, that's a self-sealing proposition. What's a self-sealing argument? Well, typically self-sealing arguments are arguments that contain among their premises self-sealing propositions. They're arguments that depend on self-sealing propositions. But there might be an example of a self-sealing argument that isn't like that. I say might. I don't say there is an example. I say there might be an example. Let me offer it to you now and see what you all think. Here's the example. Premise 1. Not every argument has a conclusion. See? Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, wait a second, didn't we define argument way back in one of those early weeks with a different teacher? Didn't we define argument as something that had one or more premises and a conclusion? Wasn't that just built into the very definition of argument? Well, look, sometimes things can be built into the very definition of something, but still you can come upon considerations or evidence that lead you to revise that definition. Right? There are all sorts of institutions in human life that are defined in various ways, and then as the world changes, we decide we want to revise that definition. And there could be good reasons for doing so. So, originally we defined an argument as some premises and a conclusion, but maybe we should revise that definition. Why does an argument need to have a conclusion? Couldn't an argument just have a premise and that's it? Well, I'll let you debate that in the forums, but I just wanted to point out that if this really is an argument, if this premise really does constitute an argument, then the premise is true that not every argument has a conclusion. But unless you can think of some way of refuting the proposition that not every argument has a conclusion, then this particular argument, consisting of the premise that not every argument has a conclusion, this particular argument is a self-sealer, because there's no evidence that you could present to show that the argument itself is unsound or unsuccessful. So, that's an example of an argument that's a self-sealer, which, if it is an argument that's a self-sealer, is not the same as any particular proposition that's a self-sealer. Because the premise, not every argument has a conclusion, that premise is a proposition, and that proposition is not a self-sealer. But if that premise is an argument, the argument may be a self-sealer. Okay? All right. So that concludes our week on fallacies of relevance and vacuity. I'll see you next week when we'll talk about refutation. See you then.